But Wayne Rogers had not signed on to be a sidekick. He had come to MASH understanding it as a true ensemble production, where the core cast would share the narrative weight equally. As the show developed its identity and Hawkeye became its undisputed center of gravity, that understanding collapsed. Trapper John, over time, became a character who reacted to Hawkeye rather than the one who drove story on his own terms. Rogers watched his character gradually lose dimension, and he wasn't willing to accept that as permanent. What makes Rogers' story uniquely fascinating is the legal dimension of his exit. His contract with the production had never been formally executed. He had been working through 3 full seasons of one of the most watched shows on television, essentially on the basis of a verbal agreement. When he decided not to return for season 4, the producers explored the idea of legal action, only to discover they had no binding contract to enforce. Rogers had not breached anything. He had simply stopped showing up. The legal situation resolved itself almost immediately because there was nothing to resolve. The show scrambled. Season 4 opened with the explanation that Trapper John had received his discharge while Hawkeye was away on leave, and just like that, 3 seasons of friendship were erased without ceremony or farewell. Fans were frustrated. Many felt robbed of closure. In Trapper's place came Mike Farrell as Captain B.J. Honeycutt, a character who was quieter, more emotionally complex, and in many ways more aligned with where MASH was heading creatively. The show didn't just survive the transition, it arguably flourished. But that doesn't diminish the abruptness of what happened, or the genuine sense of loss that longtime viewers felt. Wayne Rogers went on to build a remarkable second act entirely outside of acting. He had studied history at Princeton, and he channeled that intellectual rigor into a career as a financial analyst and investor. By the 1990s, he was a recognizable voice in economic commentary, a long way from the operating tent of the 4077th. He never seemed to carry bitterness about his time on MASH or the manner of his leaving. Alan Alda later described him as one of the most intelligent people he had ever worked with. And when Rogers passed away in 2015, Alda's tribute was warm and genuine. Whatever tensions existed between the production and its departed star had long since dissolved into something that looked very much like mutual respect. Then there is Gary Berghoff, and his story is the one that cuts deepest of all, not because of professional rivalry or contract disputes, but because of what the job itself did to him as a human being. Berghoff played Corporal Walter Radar O'Reilly, the company clerk whose almost supernatural ability to hear incoming helicopters before anyone else became one of the show's running motifs. Radar was innocent in a world that was anything but, and the contrast between his childlike optimism and the brutal reality of a war zone gave the show some of its most emotionally resonant moments. Berghoff was the only member of the MASH television cast to carry his role over from Robert Altman's original film, and he brought something to the television version that the film never quite captured: a genuine sweetness, a vulnerability that made you want to protect the character the same way the other characters in the show wanted to protect him. He was irreplaceable, and everyone on set knew it. But the demands of being irreplaceable took a serious toll. The production schedule for MASH was relentless, and Berghoff was a perfectionist by nature, which meant that every scene, every take, every episode carried a weight for him that was difficult to put down at the end of the day. He struggled with anxiety and depression during his time on the show, though these were not things that received much public attention at the time. He was also deeply affected by time away from his family. By the late 1970s, he was married and had a young daughter, and the long hours of production meant months of absence that he would later describe as one of his deepest regrets. His co-stars were aware that something was wrong. Mike Farrell, who played B.J. Honeycutt, later recalled that Berghoff often felt underappreciated, that he struggled to feel seen within an ensemble that was constantly pulling in multiple directions. There were also ongoing negotiations about his contract. Berghoff wanted better compensation, more flexibility, and a reduced workload so he could manage the pressures building in his personal life. The producers tried to accommodate him, reducing his appearances in certain seasons, but ultimately the adjustments weren't enough. In Season 8, Gary Berghoff left MASH, and unlike Wayne Rogers, he was given the kind of farewell the show did exceptionally well. A two-part episode chronicled Radar's departure from the 4077th, and it was devastating in the most beautiful way. He didn't leave because of heroism or tragedy. He left because his mother needed him, because the farm back home was struggling, and because somewhere along the way, Radar had grown up. The final image of him walking away, his teddy bear left behind on Hawkeye's bunk, said more than any speech could have. Audiences felt that goodbye in their bones. After MASH, Berghoff stepped away from the spotlight and found himself drawn to painting, to nature, to wildlife conservation. He took on a small number of projects over the years, including a short-lived television pilot. But for the most part, he chose quietness over celebrity. He has spoken in later years about the toll the show took on him, and about his decision to prioritize his well-being and his family over a career in the public eye. It's a choice that deserves nothing but respect. Larry Linville, who played the infuriating and deeply insecure Major Frank Burns, represents a different kind of departure entirely. One rooted not in burnout or rivalry, but in artistic clarity. Frank Burns was the character audiences loved to hate, the rules-obsessed, pompous antagonist, whose hypocrisy and pettiness served as the perfect comedic target for Hawkeye and the rest of the 4077th. Picture this. It's a Thursday night in 1975. Millions of Americans are crowded around their television sets, not watching a game show, not tuned into a news broadcast, but completely and utterly absorbed in a war comedy set 2 decades in the past. They're laughing, they're crying, and somewhere between those two emotions, they're thinking about things television rarely asks them to think about: mortality, sacrifice, the cost of putting human beings in the middle of a battlefield. That show was MASH, and for 11 seasons, it was unlike anything else on the air. But here's what most casual viewers never knew. Behind every camera angle, behind every scripted joke and gut-punch moment of loss, there was a cast dealing with real conflict, real frustration, and real personal struggle. Some of them walked away from the most successful show on television. Some left quietly. Others left with a kind of drama that would make the writers of MASH proud. And the reasons they gave, and the ones they didn't, tell us everything about what it truly takes to survive in Hollywood, and what it costs when the price becomes too high. MASH was never supposed to become a cultural institution. When CBS first aired it in September of 1972, based on both the best-selling novel by H. Richard Hornberger and the critically acclaimed 1970 film directed by Robert Altman, the network had modest expectations. The early ratings were rocky enough that cancellation was a genuine conversation in network boardrooms. But something unexpected happened when the show moved to Saturday nights. Audiences found it, embraced it, and refused to let go. What they connected with wasn't just the comedy, though there was plenty of sharp, irreverent humor to go around. They connected with the humanity underneath it. The show was set during the Korean War, but it was speaking directly to a generation living through Vietnam. Every episode carried that weight, whether the writers intended it to or not. Alan Alda, who stepped into the iconic role of Captain Benjamin Hawkeye Pierce, became the beating heart of the series almost immediately. But what made MASH special was never just one actor or one character. It was the ensemble, the push and pull of personalities, the friction between characters with completely different worldviews, and the strange family that formed among people who never would have chosen each other under any other circumstances. When that ensemble began to fracture in real life, it sent shockwaves through the production. And it started with the very first major departure the show ever saw. McLean Stevenson had been part of MASH since day one. He played Lieutenant Colonel Henry Blake, the commanding officer of the 4077th Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, a man who was bumbling and warm in equal measure. Henry Blake wasn't a military genius. He wasn't particularly decisive or commanding, but he was real, and that realness made him beloved. Stevenson brought a loose, improvisational energy to the role that complemented the sharper comedic instincts of Alda and the rest of the cast. He earned a Golden Globe for the performance, and by every external measure, things looked great for him. But things were not great. As MASH evolved from a loose ensemble comedy into something more emotionally sophisticated, the creative focus began to concentrate around Hawkeye. Alda, who was not only a gifted performer, but also an increasingly active creative voice behind the scenes, was writing episodes, shaping storylines, and pushing the show into deeper moral and emotional territory. That was genuinely good for MASH. It made the series better. But for McLean Stevenson, it meant watching the spotlight move further and further from where he stood. In interviews at the time, Stevenson was candid about his feelings. He wanted to be the lead. He believed he had the talent and the charisma to carry a show on his own, and he didn't want to spend his career as a supporting player, however beloved that role might be. So after 3 seasons, he made the decision to leave. What he didn't anticipate was what the writers would do with that decision. Rather than giving Henry Blake a comfortable exit, a transfer, a reassignment, a clean goodbye, the producers used his departure to make a statement about the nature of war itself. The final episode of Season 3 ended with Radar walking into the operating room and quietly delivering the news that Henry Blake's plane had been shot down over the Sea of Japan, with no survivors. It was one of the most shocking moments in television history. The cast's stunned reactions were largely genuine, because most of them hadn't been told in advance. That scene changed what television was allowed to do, and it happened because one actor decided he was ready for something bigger. What followed for Stevenson was humbling. The show he launched after MASH was canceled after a single season. A second attempt fared no better. The career he had imagined, headline billing, a show built entirely around him, never materialized the way he had hoped. In later years, he openly reflected on the decision to leave, acknowledging that MASH had been a once-in-a-generation experience. He passed away in 1996, remembered by his co-stars with genuine affection, and remembered by audiences as the man whose loss made millions of Americans feel, for the first time, that a television show could actually break their hearts.